let's kind of mosey back to the seats so we can hear
Check 1, 2.
Thank you. Excellent. Where are the same cultural references?
Folks hear me like this? Yeah, people in the back? Oh, okay, great. Cool. I got a projecting voice. All right. So, hey, I'm Anna. I make digital games, I make tabletop games, and they tell me personal games. And I want to talk about what each of these things has kind of taught me about the others. Am I still projecting well? Someone in the back yell if you can't hear me. So I'd like to start by talking about the kinds of games that make me feel the most alienated. And they might not be what you think they are. For example, they aren't this kind of game. I actually really like Infinity Blade. And they aren't even this kind of game. The games that alienate me the most are these abstract esports where the player is a little square thing shuffling a dot around the screen in this like slick minimalist recreation of some real life sport. Which is not to say that I think that these games are bad or badly designed or that they shouldn't exist or that people shouldn't play them. I'm not saying any of these things. I am saying that, this is kind of a dark screenshot on the projector, but whatever. I am saying that I find them thoroughly unrelatable, despite their minimalism and the abstract personlessness of their player avatars. Maybe it'd be more accurate to say that I find them unrelatable because of the personlessness of them. As a trans woman in games, that's me, if you can make the visual connection. I'm constantly conscious of my difference. At games events especially, I can't help but be intensely aware of my trans body. I have a hard time reducing that difference to an abstract square on a screen, just, one of many. Esports posit a competition of the mind between 2 or 2 to 4 mathematically equal and visually distinct opponents. But that's not ever the reality for marginalized people in games. They don't look the same, and they aren't treated equally. It might seem like I'm reading too much into these deliberately really simplified, abstract, minimal games. I don't think I am, for 2 reasons. One is that a lifetime of navigating the world as a trans woman has made it impossible for me not to read into things, to constantly be on guard against microaggressions. In every interaction with others, and again, especially in games, I can't help but consider the way my transness has shaped the way the other person perceives and treats me. Since so much of this judgment is invisible, I've kind of learned to, trust my gut feelings when it comes to this stuff. And 2, I think there's a real question of privilege in game creation and the kinds of games it steers people toward creating, and for whom. It might be hard to see that operating these, abstract esport games, but what do you get when you extrapolate those same game design principles into real life? You get something like Johann Sebastian Joust. And again, it's not my intent to hate on JS Joust or even to say it's a bad game. But I will say, and this is of course completely anecdotal evidence, as it always is with microaggressions, I will say I know a lot of women who have had a bad time playing this game or were even injured while playing it. JS Joust is a game that pretty explicitly favors tall people with a long reach who can easily keep their magic glow stick away from out of the reach of shorter folks. And it's certainly a game for able-bodied people. Designing a game in such a way that ignores the difference of the players is a real decision. For many designers, it's an invisible decision. That's just how privilege operates. When your body and identity are mostly normative, it's easy to assume that what applies to you is true of everyone else you're designing for. games like esports and JS Joust are often the product of a formalist approach to games, popular in some institutions, that holds games up as this pure mathematical form where comfortingly quantifiable values bounce gently off of other comfortingly quantifiable values in perfect abstracted harmony. This approach to design, where culture and context are seen as something external to the game, is interested primarily in systems. The rules and system themselves are the art here. The players themselves and their experience of the game are mostly peripheral. They're just the audience, here only as observers to the beauty of the system. No wonder it's so easy to ignore their personhood. This is my alternative model for game design, one that recognizes that culture and context are everything, and that game rules exist just to facilitate play and performance within that culture, not removed from it. Game theorists have long held this idea of the magic circle. Maybe you've heard this. A boundary that delimits everything outside the game from everything inside. But I no longer believe that that really exists. We establish boundaries when we play games for sure. That's often what allows us to feel safe to play and perform in the game in ways we might not outside of it. But we bring ourselves into that game, our expectations, our identities, our difference. We don't leave it outside the circle. There are boundaries, but not borders. And so I want to think about ways we can accommodate and celebrate difference in our games instead of assuming sameness in bodies, in identities, in skill, in strength, and experience. I'm going to drink some water. I am done drinking water. One of the things that I want to rethink is the pass-fail mechanic in games. How we grade the player's performance. Whether we make our games go brr and force the player to start the level over again. It's easy to do that in digital games, to force the player to try again and again until they pass, because computers are the perfect rules followers and scorekeepers. At least they are when they're dealing with neat quantifiable values. The limitations of computers become apparent once some human slipperiness is added to the formula. These used to be the bane of my existence. This is from Nintendo's Animal Crossing. It's a letter from the Happy Room Academy. This was an in-game organization that would periodically send you unsolicited in-game mail about the state of your in-game house, assigning you a score and typically letting you know you could do a lot better. I mean, look at this. Like, while you've made good progress, your home is far from who do these people think they are? The screenshot isn't mine. The attribute is a little cut off there, whatever. But when I played Animal Crossing, I would regularly receive letters like this about how the carefully cultivated balance of artifacts in my room just wasn't up to their expectations. These letters make me think of one of those like neighborhood committees they have in rich neighborhoods who just like bully people into watering their lawns. These are the actual criteria that the Happy Room Academy uses to rate your room, which I grabbed off the Animal Crossing wiki. So how does the computer judge interior design? Well, you can see that it values rare items in particular. It also overwhelmingly values sameness, the idea of a complete series. A series here means that you have if you have a chair that looks like it's made of candy, you should also have a bed made out of candy. You should have a closet made of chocolate, a gingerbread sofa, a table that's just a solid flan, and a lamp made from an ice cream cone. And also you'll obviously want the chocolate carpet and wallpaper to match. Some people are into this kind of set collection, and since many of these items in the game are rare items, hunting them down takes some persistence. But I find a room full of the same stuff really boring. All the candy furniture has been designed by 3D modelers at Nintendo. Same with the Halloween furniture or the modern furniture, the minimalist furniture, the striped furniture. The only real creative choice you have as a player is how to combine things, what pieces to include in a room alongside what other pieces. Incidentally, this is what a world record scoring room looks like according to the Happy Room Academy's values. It's fascinating in its own way. Packing in some of this stuff involved a lot of player exploitation of a glitch in the game. But you can see that the ideal room, according to the HRA algorithm, is basically a spreadsheet. There's as many full sets of things crammed in as possible. All of the Christmas furniture is sort of shoved against the wall unusably in one big pile. There's Nintendo memorabilia everywhere. There's gold Marios, silver Marios, other Marios, the GameCube logo, model plane from Star Fox. You know, it's like an interesting place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. An algorithm looks for values it can sort. It can understand humor, and it can understand interesting juxtapositions. I can understand, for example, why you would want to put a disco ball in an office and call it a Bay Area tech startup, for example. Nor does it get why a stately throne room with a solid gold toilet in the center of it is funny. I hope that more people would have laughed. So these last two images are from Happy Home Designer, just released, which is a spin-off of Animal Crossing, where you work as an interior decorator. Animals hire you to design their dream homes for them. And what's deeply interesting to me about this game is that there's almost no pass-fail criteria whatsoever. The characters will suggest a theme for their home and insist that you include 2 to 3 particular pieces of furniture. And that's it. In this screen, the 2 items are the bench and the chairs. She wanted a TV show studio with a set for a courtroom drama and a set for a game show. Game show is behind the camera, so you can't see it. But then everything else in this picture is all me. The scales on the judge's bench are from the Zodiac set. They're Libra scales. The break area in the foreground with the lockers and the flowers and the cafe latte was my own invention. And the game show set, which is not visible, uses this like doomsday button prop as like a buzzer. And this is a room from my haunted hotel, and the only requirement here was that it had a bed. Any bed. As long as the requisite items are included, you can include or exclude whatever pieces in whatever configuration you want. The game will never ever reject any home you build for any other reason. And what's more, and this really surprised me coming from some of the other Animal Crossing games, is that it makes no effort whatsoever to apply any sort of grade to your creation. Wisely, I think, the developers of Happy Home Designer have crowdsourced the task of understanding and assigning value to the process of a game that is entirely about creativity. The only feedback you receive from your designs is online. Other players can choose to rate rooms that you upload by tagging them BuzzFeed style in any of 4 categories. And you can see that there's no real way to leave negative feedback unless you read unique in a really sarcastic way. Unique is the rating I've gotten the most of, so maybe you can. Also, this is outdated and all my scores are way higher now. Animal Crossing has always been a series that challenged traditional ideas of goals and games, but even so, I think the passivity of Happy Home Designer is a tremendous strength to the game. How it resists any effort to quantify the creative act. What if we measure our games not by whether players succeeded, but by what experiences they created for them, for themselves and others? So, I've been going through a transition from making digital games to making tabletop games. I've been releasing my tabletop games under the label Sorry Not Sorry Games, website www.sorrynotsorry.biz, major score. Despite how much of a challenge coding can be for me, tabletop game making was really intimidating after working with digital games. With a non-digital game, there's no mechanical way to enforce your rules. You have to depend on the players themselves to keep the rules, and those players will interpret your rules and use their best judgment. The appealing thing about tabletop design is also the thing I found the most terrifying, that a rule can be anything. Without an established model to build on, tabletop design is incredibly open-ended. I think that's why I designed my most ambitious tabletop project, Bewitching, backwards. Water break. Okay. So Bewitching is a game where players design outfits for their witches to wear to a magical ball, and then lobby for awards from other players in this reality TV show style open discussion round. It's a game of imagination and performance and giving props to your friends for their brilliant ideas. And it's a game I ultimately am really proud of. I've been developing it and releasing new versions since April. It's currently in its 3rd edition. It's a pretty open-ended game that's driven almost entirely by player creativity, but that wasn't always the case. Once upon a time, it was an overcomplicated monster of a game heavily based on Cosmic Encounter of all things. It had a simultaneous secret bidding system and special power cards that let you change the outcome of auctions in your favor. You can see those power cards along the back of the image, and you can probably see that they have way too much text on them. They're just covered in text. This was not a lighthearted, playful game of imagining witch outfits with your friends. Fortunately, playtesting made it possible to get rid of most of the detritus by the time I released version 1.0 of the game. But the example that I want to talk about is something that did end up making it into the first release of Bewitching, and was fortunately gone by version 2.0. These are the house cards for the original Bewitching, or at least my index card prototypes for them. By combining them at random, you form the names of different witch houses that are attending the ball. So each name has a first part, like witch or raven or wolf, and the second part, like queen or candle or wolf. But each card also has an aesthetic keyword, like witchy or dark or furry. When you combine them, you get a house's unique style. Each player at the beginning of the game would pick one of the houses and then get to judge which of the players' outfits best fit that style. I was pretty proud of the system, which I basically stole from a board game called Small World, which is not a game I even really like. In Small World, the nations that the players control are created by combining 2 traits at random. Like, for example, Historian and Kraken. The image is kind of dark, I'm sorry for that. I thought adapting it to Bewitching was clever. It generated an aesthetic and a cute, witchy name. I had fallen in love with my own system. My infatuation with the system that I created made it hard for me to see at first that it didn't exactly work. There were 2 major problems with it. One, there was a lot of cognitive dissonance around players choosing houses. If someone chooses House Witch Cat, it's because she wants to draw an outfit that's witchy and animal themed, not because she wants to decide which of the other players drew it best. Players tended to pick their own favorite aesthetics and then didn't get to draw them. So that was totally backwards. But 2, the system was contradictory to the point of meaningless. How can you simultaneously draw a witchy and animal themed aesthetic, a monochromatic and metallic aesthetic, and a soft and furry aesthetic? The system didn't add to the game, I was just attached to the artifice of it. Not only did it not add to the game, I would say it got in the way of the game. It got in the way of meaningful play. So I finally cut out this entire system and replaced it with a technology that I am calling blank index cards. Now players write their own awards at the beginning of a game. So this gets rid of the cognitive dissonance. You're making up your own award, so of course you're going to be the one who decides who gets it, who gives it out. It also lets you steer what kind of outfits other players are going to draw, adding a new layer of player interaction to the game. And this works so much better than the complicated system it replaced. It's just index cards. One of the lessons I learned from this, first is to start simple, not to start super ambitious, which is something you think I'd know from my years making digital games. But I think I felt this need to show off my board game literacy almost. I clung to game conventions that I knew, even though they ended up not being right for the game I was making. But the other important lesson was that offloading the burden of play from the rules and system themselves onto my brilliant, creative players produced amazing results. I talked about digital games having the problem of forcing players to play a certain way, but the truth is that many board games are equally systems obsessed. I play a lot of board games that are just self-contained puzzles, with each player toiling away on her own personal engine alone. And then whoever built the most efficient engine wins. That's not why I play games. I play games for the stories. I play games to hear my friends say brilliant and hilarious and clever things. Too often, I think we as designers and developers get in the way of play instead of nurturing it like the beautiful flower it is. So, personal games seem to be what everyone wants from marginalized game developers these days. Would I call Bewitching a personal game? Yes, I would. It's about my transfeminine identity, about powerful, magical, transformative femininity. It's inspired by my childhood of discovering and playing with digital paper dolls on my computer. It's a very personal game. But that's not what people usually mean when they say personal game. They mean autobiographical game, or message game, or empathy game. I could spend this entire talk unpacking the phrase empathy game, but fortunately for all of you, I'm completely sick of it. Instead, I'm going to talk about message games, the idea of using a game as a vector to transmit some kind of premeditated message. I want to get my players to think about X. How can I make my players aware of X? Games are what kids are into these days, right? I think these sentiments often come from really admirable motivations, though sometimes they come from the World Bank. But I think they also ignore some of the fundamental strengths of art and of games, and use games in a reductive and insincere way. The fact is that the personal in games comes as much from how a game looks and feels, its style, its attitude, its texture, as it does from its message. An author's personality comes through in all of the little decisions that an author makes. Undertale, which is currently the top-rated game of all time on Metacritic, is loved as intensely for a scene where you can pet a dog so much that its head wraps around the screen. You can't see it, but there's a head at the bottom of that text window. It's loved so much for this scene as it is for its big picture themes of friendship and nonviolence. I had a really hard time finding this screenshot because of how much fan art there is of this dog. Fan art of this. The idea of games as just packaging for a message is almost as reductive as the formalism that champions streamlined, plasticky esports games. And this is why I feel like polish is the enemy of personal games. The rough corners that we often try and iron out of our games are our personality. They're our humanity. Our presence in our games isn't a bug to be polished away. My advice on making personal games is, don't start with a message. Don't start with a takeaway. Takeaway is a word often used by industry executives who want to be sure that they're being perceived as supporting diversity without actually changing their policies or practices. Instead, I like to start with an experience. Start with something tangible for the player to do. In Bewitching, I wanted players to sit down with markers and what's essentially a page from a coloring book, drawing a cool femme space outfit in a way I really got to do as a trans child. My game, A Wish for Something Better, is an attempt to externalize a process that helped me deal with loss in my life. A process of sitting with myself, taking assessment of the absences in my life, and imagining other futures that comforted or addressed my hurt. I wanted to codify those processes into a ritual that other people could perform. It's a deeply personal game, inviting a player basically into my own personal coping process. And one of my recent digital games, Oh My God, Are You Alright, is an autobiographical game. It's about my experience getting hit by a car in June. And I wanted to emphasize the suddenness with which it happens by creating this sort of cute, lighthearted Frogger type game that changes suddenly and jarringly into a piece of autobiographical interactive fiction as soon as you're hit by a car. As marginalized creators, I think it's important that we not let our identities or our lives be reduced to takeaways. To folks in the UK, a takeaway means takeout food, and that's appropriate. What I think is expected of marginalized creators often is to create something consumable, something easily digested. When we're asked to frame our work in terms of a message, it's worth asking who that message is for. The truth of our lives comes through in our work, but it's not in some neatly packaged line of dialogue that proponents of gamification can quote on their blogs. It's everywhere. Allow yourself to be larger than a message. I want to conclude my talk with some ideas for ways we can rethink the role of the game as a simple arbiter of whether the player wins or loses. In fact, that is the theme of the workshop that's going to be happening right here, except in another building, in a little while. Not actually sure where, but someone in this room does. Make a game that doesn't decide whether the player passes or fails. Digital game, if you brought your own laptop. Tabletop game, we have tabletop game making supplies, role-playing game, whatever. It's a pretty open-ended theme, and it could mean a lot of things. So I'm going to give some examples. What about a game where, and sorry again that this is kind of dark, what about a game where the player decides when they've won? This is Stephen Lavell's Subway Adventure. This game features a subway system with a lot of stations, 8 different lines, and transfers between them. The only instruction the player is given is to pick a location, any location, and find a way there. I like this game because it's about the satisfaction of negotiating a transit system without the stress of missing trains or the anxiety of commuting with strangers. There's no victory state. You can choose something easy to get to or something far away. You can try and stop at each location, or you can just ride the lines. You can decide you're done when you reach your objective, or you can choose a new one. The game doesn't impose its own goal on the player, but it provides a framework for letting the player set her own goals. There are places of interest. There are places that the process of getting to is interesting. It's easy to look at the map and go, personhood of trains, I've got to go there. And then figure out what transfers you have to make to get there from wherever you are. It's a self-directed puzzle with a self-guided endpoint. Or what about a game where the player decides when she's failed instead? This is Asphyx by Droken. In this game, whenever the player character is underwater, the actual real player needs to hold their real actual breath. And if they fail, they can tap out by hitting the escape key, which signals to the game that they've drowned. The tap out key is actually a pretty inclusive option. Not everyone has the same lung capacity, and not everyone can hold their breath for super long. Since you, the player, are the one who is deciding when you fail the game, you can fudge it a little. You can be less strict about the rule. You can adapt the game to your own abilities. You can even ignore the rule entirely, which is an option that the game explicitly acknowledges. Or, what about a game that you don't win or lose, but which produces a tangible record or piece of art to take away from it? This is Tony Dollar's How to Host a Dungeon. You provide the tracing paper, pencils, or dice. Then you roll on some tables and you see what you draw. Over successive ages of this dungeon, natural caverns form, civilizations move into them, rise and fall, building mines, creating empires, and then those empires die out, leaving underground ruins for monsters to haunt. And what you're left with is a map that illustrates the entire history of the dungeon that you've created. Pretty neat. Talk about bewitching again. All of the outcomes in that game are the result of player votes. Players give awards to other players. The 2 players with the most awards become finalists in the interview round. And all the other players, the players who don't become finalists, become the judges who decide which of the 2 finalists is the winner. And if they can't reach consensus, then each finalist counts up how many tips they've received, tips being tokens that players award to other players. usually for something funny or clever or cool that that player did. Now I want to talk about a few children's books, because I find children's books to be an ongoing source of inspiration when it comes to framing and evoking play. A children's book, or any book really, has no way of enforcing rules. They depend entirely on the complicity of the reader. Thus, they're completely adaptable to the experience the reader wants out of the book. If you can't find Waldo on this page, the book doesn't care. It's not going to stop you from looking at the rest of the pages. Maybe you just want to look at all the cool pictures. If you're reading a book to your kid, it's important to be able to adapt the reading to the kind of experience your kid wants or expects. Either, a really passive bedtime story, or a much more actively involved reading experience, or a guessing game. Maybe your kid wants to read the book to you. One of my favorite books is The Z Was Zapped by Chris Van Allsburg. Van Allsburg is the author and illustrator of Jumanji, as well as The Wreck of the Zephyr, and that book about the Christmas train that was adapted into that really weird CGI movie. There are a lot of weird movie adaptations of this guy's books. Fortunately not this one, or unfortunately maybe. The Z Was Zapped is an alphabet book. Here's what a typical page looks like. I'm kind of dark. On every page, something terrible happens to a letter of the alphabet. Some of them are really gruesome, actually. I'd be thankful I didn't include the N, which was nailed and nailed again. This letter A is getting off pretty light. The letter A, of course, was caught in an avalanche. But the words being depicted in each illustration don't actually appear on the same page. They appear on the next page. You have to turn the page to find out what the word being illustrated is. And this simple decision introduces a little guessing game to the book. You can't help but guess what the appropriate word is happening when you see an illustration. The bee was badly bitten. It doesn't matter if you're right, and it also doesn't matter if you're even guessing at all. It's easy to imagine that an iPad version of this book might force you to enter the correct word before it would let you move on to the next page. But the book doesn't care. And this is a book called Welcome to Momoko. It's sort of like Where's Waldo, except there's no explicit structure whatsoever. There's no one due defined in every single page. Instead, every page represents an hour in a single day, and there's a whole cast of recurring characters whose movements and interactions over the course of that one day can be tracked from page to page. Per the bottom of the image, you can see Magical Miss Chubb riding on a truck full of boxes, like toward into the future. And the blue box that's falling off the truck is the one that she's been carrying around all day. What's in it? If you find her at the right moment of the day, maybe you'll find out. So there's a lot of different opportunities for play here. Picking a single character and following her across every page, or trying to find out how all the different characters' paths cross and interact over the course of a day. Or even just spotting a character that interests you on one page and then flipping backwards or forward to figure out what happened prior, what happens next. The reader is able to move seamlessly between any and all of these goals at any time. And last is Ella Bailey's No Such Thing. This is a book about a girl who doesn't believe in ghosts, and yet there are ghosts hiding on every single page. If you look closely, you can see one hiding in the fridge behind the milk. There's also one being chased by a dog on the right, so that one's easier to see. In this book, the game of spotting ghosts is completely peripheral to the story, and yet it's everywhere. It's everywhere in the book. It's a whole second layer to what's going on. If you were reading this to your kid, maybe you'd read the words and then ask her if she saw any ghosts. Maybe only after reading ended would she go back and discover that the ghosts are everywhere. And this is what I like about children's books, that they can just casually include playful activity, that they can evoke playful activity without needing to foreground it, to legislate it, to tell their audience the correct way of engaging with it. That's an attitude that I want to bring into my own work, one that's inclusive of player collaboration, a design that accommodates player choice and style rather than insisting that the player engages with my game on its terms and its terms alone. games are expanding so much in terms of subject matter, in terms of what they're about and who they're able to be about. But let's also expand how they play, what they value, what they expect from the player, what they give back. I know I've fallen into the trap of making a game with challenging subject matter, but failing to rethink tropes of how the game is actually played. Do many personal games gain by making a player play a level over and over again until they get it right? I want to think about how to nurture play, to allow play to unfold, instead of letting traditional ideas about what a game should be stifle that play. You can find some of the games that I talked about, including Bewitching and The Wish for Something Better at sorryNotSorry.biz. And I hope some of you will stick around for the workshop. We're going to have supplies, like I said, for making tabletop games if you want to work in a digital game. If you have a laptop, then that's fine. Otherwise, steal a laptop. My timer's a little off, so do we have time for questions? Yeah, so any questions? Let's see, is there any hands I'm missing? I mean, if you have no questions, that's fine too. I mean, just go and like think about it. Think about what I said. Yes?
What made you want to go towards board games initially? Like, was there a spark? Was there some kind of fire?
Okay, so the game that actually really, I think, really sort of got me super interested in board games, that made me like be like, this is the place where I want to be right now. There's this game called, okay, first there was a book called Machine of Death. It's about a machine that predicts how everyone's going to die, but only in an extremely like abstract monkey's paw sort of a way. So like you could get like, it like takes a blood sample and then it gives you like, maybe you get old age and that means you could like, you're going to die of old age, or that you get hit by a car that's being driven by like your grandma. I don't know. A while ago, they made a board, or rather a card game based around this premise, licensed game. And so the way that game works is all the players are collaborating as a team of assassins. But the problem is that because this machine exists, you need to kill this person in a way that does not contradict the death that the machine has foretold for them. So you might get like foil is a way someone needs to die, and that means either they die because you've wrapped them in aluminum foil, or you killed them with a fencing foil, or maybe their plan got foiled. I don't know. And so this game is like extremely open-ended, and the way that you actually play it is that cards will have extremely vague categories on them. You get 3 things to incorporate into your murder plan. And one of them might be a kind of headwear. What kind of headwear that is totally up to you to decide. And it's an entirely player-driven process where players come up with a plan, they assign difficulty to the plan they've created, and they try to execute it. And that was just so super fascinating for me, the idea that a game could be so player-directed like that. And that's a thing that's really hard to do and really rare to see in digital games a lot of the time. And so, if I was to point to the moment where I was like, the stuff that I feel like I want to be doing right now can only really be done in like tabletop games, I think that would be the game. Also, I completely endorse that game, and everyone should play it. Any other questions? That was a good question. Thank you.
I really like your sort of thoughts about making games with your friends in mind, and with a certain caring intent.
That's not a question. No, it's fine.
I wonder if you've ever thought about making games for your enemies.
Oh man, I feel like I've made a game or two for my enemies. So off the top of my head, I made a game about Michigan Women's Music Festival a while ago, which was, it's called Transgression. It's a game where you are a radical lesbian separatist, you're a radical feminist, trying to figure out which of the women at this year's Mitch Fest has a penis. and eject her from the festival before the festival was destroyed from within. And so, I mean, so that game was clearly an attempt to embody, you know, sort of the values of my enemies in a way that pointed out the absurdity of them, the sort of ridiculousness of like tracking everyone's genitals at like a music festival. So I heartily endorse making games, you know, for your enemies, but I think if they end up playing it, then it's even better. I don't know whether any Mitchfest organizers have played Transgression. Probably. I don't know if they know how to use computers. It's unclear. But it's actually not true because the game was in response to a cyberstalking incident. But that's all I want to talk about Church for today. Any other questions? That was a good question too. Yes.
Do you have any advice about how to? So if you have a game where people create things, and you don't want there to be any pass or fail to it, how can you give meaningful feedback on what people have created? Like, you want them to feel like they've done a good job, but it's like it's between being like no feedback at all and pass fail. Like I don't want either of those, but.
Well, I mean, I feel like the answer to that always lies in other people. It doesn't lie in the computer. And if like, you know, I would say for, you know, if you're talking about a digital game, then I would err toward making the computer be as affirmative as possible. In the case of you know, Happy Home Designer, which is a creative game about making creative stuff, you know, all of the approval or, you know, all of the feedback comes from other players, and that feedback, the, you know, avenues that you give those feedback are skewed so that they can't really be negative. But you know, that, you know, with real players, that's an option if that was the thing that that suited the game. You know, when people play Bewitching, it's all the people who are at the table with them, all the like human beings with them, who are reacting to their pieces, asking questions about them, you know, not even necessarily in a 100% affirming way, and you know, just in engaging with them way. Yeah, I think the real solution is just people, and you know, even in the case of you know, a digital game, if you create something, you can put it online, you can post it on your Twitter, people can see it, people can say stuff. And so people can say pretty bad stuff also. But yeah, I think whenever creative feedback exists in the game, it has to be coming from people who, you know, from actual people who understand the culture and the context, and not from machines. And I think when game programmers try to fudge that, try to, you know, create like algorithms that, you know, want to make it seem like they understand, like they know what's going on, and give that kind of feedback, I think they always lead to awkwardness, to frustration, and to, you know, the feeling of like, to a feeling that I think is almost even more impersonal than if they had offered no feedback, in my experience. I hope that answers your question. Cool. Yes.
If you make a game where the player always wins or always loses, does it follow the prompt of not having a pass-fail mechanic?
That's a great question. I think so. You mentioned to me earlier, before my talk, we talked about my game Dysphoria. In that game, there are a number of scenes where, regardless of whether the player passes or fails, where there is a fail state and a pass state, but the game still goes on to the next screen regardless. And of course, there are scenes where where there's no failure, and there are scenes where it's only failure. And so I think that, I mean, I guess to answer your question, well, I guess I'd be more interested in examining not whether pass and fail exists there, but what the role is of it. And so usually, you know, pass fail is used to either make a player repeat something or to track the player into a different part of the game. And I think there are ways to use passing and failing that are not, that drive the story forward rather than backwards. There are ways where failure is interesting. I mean, you know, in this story in particular, failure is really interesting to me because that was, you know, so much a part of my experience of transition. And so, but I think really it's just a matter of not taking passing and failing for granted, which is the thing I see a lot of digital game designers do. The idea that, you know, the player expects that if, or rather, the truth is that the designer expects that the player expects that if they mess up, they're gonna, you know, they're gonna fail and have to start the level over. I don't know if that's, I mean, maybe that's true for some gamers, but I don't think that's a thing that would be missed in a lot of cases, especially in the cases of like games that are about telling stories, especially personal stories. And I think really the problem is just an unwillingness to examine that part of the game, to allow that to be, to go invisibly, like, unstated. So yeah, I don't think pass-fail mechanics on their own, even though this is kind of not, I don't know if this is the question that you asked, but I don't think that pass-fail mechanics on their own are necessarily a bad idea. I just think that the ubiquity of them and sort of including them without really thinking what the effect they have on the experience is a bad idea. And then I think people should, designers should try and rethink, and you know, even within any individual project, think about what they're using pass-fail for and how they're using it and what effect it's having on the player's experience. Cool. I don't know where we're at for time.
I mean, we can go for a few more questions.
Oh yeah, it's
I would really help that a little. Do you think for some games, especially like story-based games, there should be a condition where, let's say, you keep hitting a pass-fail condition and you keep failing no matter what you do. Every time you just, a player doesn't have the ability or the, let's say, on a console game, the dexterity to pass that point. Should they have a way to, an option after a certain number of fails to just bypass?
well, I mean, I guess it's again like not really like a should or shouldn't. However, if you're making a kind like a dexterity game that's challenging that requires a certain level of game literacy and physical dexterity, then that's an issue of ability, and that's an issue of it potentially be an issue of physical ability. It also can be an ability, a question of just someone's level of game experience, of fluency, of game literacy that tends to mostly favor, you know, young people, specifically, you know, like young people who are gamer identified, who have been playing games all their life, who are, you know, engaged in games as a culture. Which is mostly, I don't even know if I can say that it's mostly male, because I don't think that may not even necessarily be true anymore. But there's real, when you make decisions like that, you're making real decisions about who's going to be playing your game. And also, often invisible decisions about who can't play your game. And so I think those are, you know, I think those are also questions designers need to be asking. One idea that I think is valuable is the idea of giving the player means to select for their own difficulty. And I don't mean just like doing like, you know, do you want easy game, normal, or hard at the beginning? There's like, what's a good example of this? So in Team Fortress 2, let's say, Team Fortress 2 has characters who are like the sniper, for example, who are very much focused around the precision, around physical ability, around dexterity, about the ability to aim at a fast-moving target really quickly and hit it. And then there are characters also like, I mean, not saying that Team Fortress 2 isn't a restrictive experience for other reasons, but then there's also characters like the Heavy, who just, you know, sprays bullets and doesn't require a lot of precision, but still can often end up in a really, central and empowering role in a team. And so I think that usually what's a good idea is to give the player some means of, and not even at just the beginning of the game when they have no context for it, but entrenched in the context of the game, an on-the-fly decision that will allow them to select for an easier or harder game as they go. For example, like in a shooty man kind of a game, giving a player a really big gun that doesn't require accuracy and can like basically obliterate people in one shot, but then letting her decide whether she wants to use it or not. That's a contextual difficulties decision that the player can make. She could, you start on normal or hard, but you don't know what that means. But if you are playing through the game and it gets too hard for you, then maybe you can be like, oh, I'm gonna use the big gun. And that I think gives the player more, that lets the player select for their own level of decision of difficulty in a way that's more meaningful to her, and also in a way that's ongoing, that's not just, predetermined, it's embedded in context. And the same idea applies to games that aren't about shooting people. Yeah, I think basically giving the player means to adjust her own experience of the game as she plays, if it's a game that, is technically forbidding in some way, is a good idea. One more question. Because I was just looking straight at you. So
I know we made direct eye.
Mm-hmm.
As someone that likes exploration and story in games, I've always really hated the grading system. And so like there's nothing more frustrating than playing like Hotline Miami for like an hour straight and not being able to like beat a level. And then finally you do, and it's like, oh, you got a D because you took way too much time. And so I really like this idea of like, of it saying, well, you didn't do, you took your time, but you were accurate. So maybe, I'm comparing Hotline Miami to Animal Crossing, but like I kind of like I like this idea where instead of like grading you on, you didn't do this, but you did this. Maybe it will do the Animal Crossing thing where it's like you're sneaky, but you're not, and like you'll like whatever amount of points like it kind of resonates more into. It could.
You just took the scenic route.
Yeah, exactly.
As all dads would say.
Right.
My dad used to say that all the time.
I guess I'm just wondering, like, do you think we could see more of that within, like, definitely I feel like we could see it in, like, an indie industry, but maybe, like, AAA industry? Like, do you think that's possible, or do you think that people are always going to want, like, a rating system?
I mean, the AAA industry is kind of always in the process of appropriating more and more of what the indie sphere is doing. That's sort of, what the ecology is, that like, marginalized people down here are doing really interesting things, and then indie people are here taking those ideas and making money off of them, and then ultimately rising up to AAA games, and who are frantically throwing money around trying to find something that people aren't gonna stop playing in a few years. Meaning, like, not in terms of individual games, because individual games from AAA publishers have a very, very short lifespan. But it's the idea that the games, as this sort of industry exists right now, don't really have much of a future. Yes, I think. Well, I mean, even Animal Crossing is an example of Nintendo, right? Doing something like this. They had this system in previous Animal Crossing games, which were not, completely creatively focused. But Animal Crossing is a creative game before it's really like a pass-fail kind of game. And even they could recognize that the system that they had in previous Animal Crossing games was not going to work in this game that was exclusively creativity focused. And that, to me, that was pretty amazing, that like there weren't even levels of how much I liked it from the designing for characters. There wasn't even, their comments didn't even belie the suggestion that you could have a better than great success. And so I don't know. I think more and more what's going to happen is that, yeah, that's gonna happen also. That that kind of valuation of things is going to get crowdsourced more and more. The other good Nintendo example is Super Mario Maker, in which it basically relies entirely on not only direct player feedback, but also on analytics from player experiences, like whether a level you create ends up being classed as easy, medium, hard, is dependent on ratios of how many people have played it, how many people have actually finished it, how many people gave up in the middle. So I think even in the industry, even in sort of the AAA sphere, I think as creativity in games is becoming more, I think, marketable to those big corporations, they're also appropriating ideas about how to grade those games or grade those the creations appropriately, and in a way that is not entirely deterministic. I had something else to say, but I forgot it. So I hope I answered your question. Cool. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed the workshop. Okay, cool.
So it's about 2 o'clock. So let's start the workshop at 2:30, which is it's about a block away at 243 South Wabash. It's where Indy City Games usually meets, if you're familiar with that. And there's a few places to grab food around here, so you might want to grab food and just go right to the workshop, or you could eat and just come by. But if you need directions or something, just ask me, and I'll try to help you find it.
All right, enjoying some food.